The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you wish to participate in the program, tune in at 5 p.m. every Wednesday for A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Well, welcome to the show, everyone. We have a special guest tonight. We're going to talk about this November's ballot, and specifically a measure that is on the ballot to amend the Louisiana State Constitution. Our guest tonight is going to be on the phone. Her name is Professor Angela A. Bell. She's a B.K. Enighoutry Endowed Associate Professor of Legal Analysis and Writing. She is a native of New Orleans and a 1998 graduate of Southern University Law Center in Baton Rouge. Professor Bell is a committed public servant who frequently lends her time to causes involving social and or restorative justice, criminal justice reform, and prisoner re-entry. And those are big issues, as you know, for me in past shows and, of course, everyone else in the radio station, and presumably you. In any case, she's here to talk about something that she and I both think is very important, and that is the proposed amendment to the state constitution that is on the ballot this November. Good evening, Professor Bell.
Good evening, and thanks so much for having me.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Believe me, like I told you before we went on, you're going to teach me new things, and we'll just be able to pass them on to the listeners, too. Anyway, Professor Bell, I would like to start out with a direct quote that I took from, I downloaded the Louisiana, I guess it was the minutes from the convention or the debate over the Louisiana Constitution in 1898. And this is the Honorable Thomas J. Simmons, chairman of the Committee on the Judiciary, who attended that gathering. And this is what he said. "Now then, what have we done is the question. Our mission was, in the first place, to establish the supremacy of the white race in this state to the extent to which it could be legally and constitutionally done, and what has our ordinance on suffrage, the constitutional means by which we propose to maintain that ascendancy, done. We have established throughout the state white manhood suffrage." And what was he talking about?
Well, Mr. Sims was actually very G-rated. If you would continue and read the words of the president, Krusenick, who was also a member of the bar, but Krusenick takes it a step further, and what he says, this is a direct quote, is that when we assembled for these 98 days, we assembled for two reasons. Reason one, according to Krusenick, was to protect the purity of the ballot box. And then, of course, reason two was to perpetuate the supremacy of the Anglo-Saxon race. So these are the two most powerful men at that 1898 Constitution, and in very explicit terms are making it clear that they operated with a racial agenda. And it was one, to be certain that the African Americans who were recently freed from slavery would not be able to use that vote that the federal government had promised them they could. And of course, secondarily, it was to further a caste system, to make sure that every accomplishment that the federal government thought that it realized at the end of the Civil War was not going to materialize, because they would remain a supremacist system. So this text is very explicit. It makes people nervous because people don't like to acknowledge that you can have racism in many forms. It is often people think it's through individuals, but this is a good illustration of racism through policy, law, and practice. So we sometimes overlook that racism can happen in many forms. This is not refutable, but what's fascinating to me about the years of research I've done on this law is when I initially started this research some years ago, I saw this and thought this has to be the absolute worst thing that I could ever see. But over the years, I have learned that there were intended consequences, of course, the ones we just talked about, but there's a series of unintended consequences, and I would argue with you that they're worse than that original intent. So that is the reason why I believe that this piece of legislation that will be before the voters on November the 6th will be the most important piece of legislation, criminal justice legislation, in our lifetime.
Okay, Professor Bell, I need to cut in real quickly. What you're talking about is the proposed amendment number 2 to the state constitution, which will require a unanimous jury conviction before anyone can be convicted, and a unanimous jury decision before anyone can be convicted of a non-capital offense. And as I understand it, what happened with this, the 1898 Constitution, was that up until that point, Louisiana did require a unanimous verdict for non-capital felony convictions. But as a result of Reconstruction and the civil rights, the freeing of slaves and everything, they established the precedent, really, that non-unanimous jurors or juries could send someone to jail for life.
Yes, I would like to also add a caveat. In the late 1880s, when we changed our system from a unanimous system, as you pointed out, we were unanimous when Louisiana was adopted into the federal system. We have always been unanimous into the late 1880s. At that time, we changed it from a vote of 9 of 12, and it remained 9 of 12 to convict in Louisiana until the year 1973, when we raised the threshold by 1 and changed it to 10 of 12. So at the moment, we have a law that is allowing convictions on felony level, hard labor sentences, when you have 10 people on a jury of 12 that says this is a guilty. So what that means in reality is that conceivably number 11 and number 12, they may have reasonable doubt. They may feel that that particular defendant is not guilty, but under our current system, we are allowed to proceed with a conviction. And that's not a small matter when you give attention to the extreme nature of our sentencing scheme in the state of Louisiana, because oftentimes we're dealing with hard labor, life sentences that are mandatory and not negotiable. So we're literally taking people's lives without the assent of 12 jurors. And when you have 1 or 2 sometimes registering concerns about the fact that the prosecutor just did not prove a case beyond reasonable doubt. And you'll hear many people say that, oh, there are only 2 states that do this, it's just Louisiana and Oregon. There's a little truth to that, but I want to be sure to be very, very clear. Oregon and Louisiana are the only 2 states that allow these non-unanimous juries in these felony-level trials, but Oregon has not been as egregious as Louisiana when it comes to violating Sixth Amendment rights. And the reason I say that is because Oregon specifically under their law says that if it is a murder conviction in the first degree, you must have a unanimous 12. So there is a slight bit of protection for those first-degree murder cases in Oregon. There is no such protection under Louisiana law. So that makes our law a lot more extreme, because what we're doing in Louisiana is actually sending people to life sentences for first-degree murder cases on these non-unanimous juries, and you cannot do that in Oregon. They at least require 12 in the case of first-degree murder.
Okay, well, that brings up something I wanted to ask you, too. The proposed amendment that will be on the ballot this November for Louisiana states is going to require unanimous conviction or unanimous jury decision to convict anyone of a non-capital offense. Does that mean that it still requires, the law now requires unanimous juries to convict for something with the death penalty?
That is correct. At the moment, if it is a capital case, our law presently requires a unanimous vote of 12.
Okay.
And that will remain the case. So that is not at issue. What is at issue is for cases that are non-capital and felony. So what the law will do now is protect all cases that are not capital but felony level and require that the vote be unanimous. But the law is also protecting future convictions, so it is not retroactive. It will not go back in time and undo any current convictions. It will essentially say on or after January 1st, 2019, this law is going to take effect. And if you support this, as I do, you would want to vote yes to Amendment 2 when you do vote on November the 6th.
Yes, I would agree with you. This also seems, I also suspect that the prohibition on convicted felons voting is related to this issue, if not directly, indirectly. It had the same reason or the same purpose behind it, to reduce, to establish or maintain the purity of the vote in Louisiana.
I absolutely would agree with you. And one of the things, as we discuss this law, it's very important to understand it in its historical context. Yes, we know it arose in the late 1800s, but we also must remember that this came from a state that had decided it wanted slavery so bad it was going to go to war. So this was all about a state trying to tell the federal government that we have a way we do business in Louisiana. We want a caste system. We do not want people having equality, which is what voting affords us. So there was great resistance at the end of the Civil War. Although Louisiana lost, Louisiana wanted to make the point to the federal government that you can put any law in the Constitution, but when it comes to how it is going to be enforced and enacted on a state level, we are never going to comply. So this was an attempt on the part of Louisiana from the days of them losing the Civil War to make it very clear that black people will not have the right to vote in the state because voting affords them power. And the power has been what this fight is about. So, yes, you are correct when you point out that our felony disenfranchisement law, it was born of these same bad intentions. So that if we can criminalize people, we take their rights to vote, and we want to criminalize people not only because we not want them voting, but we must also remember at the same time that we have this law enacted, we also have the birth of convict leasing in the state of Louisiana. So it's very convenient because what was being done with the convicts who were leased is they were working to build levees in the state. They were doing all of the agricultural work that was not being done anymore on plantations because slavery ended. So this law was designed to essentially make sure that slavery continued despite the fact that there was such a thing called the 13th Amendment written into the Constitution, and to make sure that there would be a caste system and that supremacy would prevail despite the fact that there was such a thing called a 14th Amendment in the Constitution. So these are deliberate efforts, and it looks like on the surface we're having a dated conversation because we're talking about 1800s, but if you understand this, this kind of gives you a window into the lack of progress that we have made as a people, because actually in 2018, we're still fighting attempts to have us not vote, those attempts that were orchestrated in the 1800s. And we're still fighting efforts to keep us criminalized because it's profitable for certain people. So we really have not gone as far as many of us would like to think when we understand this law in its proper historical context.
Yes, and I would point out, too, in practical terms, regardless of whatever motivations were behind it, the non-unanimous felony convictions, the effects of that policy, of that law, is clearly racist. Is clearly achieving that, the goal of the white supremacists, even if they don't want to say it now, even if we deny it now. So yeah, I'm sure there are a lot of things on the books, that were originated to suppress the black vote and black people in general, that are no longer known as having been that, but that's the effect they still have, and people nowadays aren't aware of it. But of course, black people need to be aware of it, and they mostly are.
And I would agree with that point, but I also want to make the point that there's an aspect of this that has nothing to do with race, and I want to talk to you about that for a second. and that is the fact that the last time the United States Supreme Court decided to entertain this question was in 1972 in a case called Apodaca, and it was that ruling that essentially blessed Oregon's system of using non-unanimous juries, and so by default, Louisiana court says, well, we have a precedent because the Supreme Court has said that it's not illegal to do this in Oregon, it's not illegal to do it here. That's been their flawed reasoning. Now, what's important about Apodaca is when it was decided in 1972, there was just no research to help us understand group dynamics and jury deliberations and group thinking. It just didn't exist. Apodaca actually inspired that research. So today we have over 45 years of very credible research that teaches us some very powerful lessons about juries and deliberations and that group thinking. And what we now know is that there are two different verdict styles. There is an evidence-driven verdict, and then there is a verdict-driven style. So under the evidence-driven, the jury will say, hey, let's talk about the evidence a little, and we'll hear everybody, meaning all 12 people's appreciation of that evidence. Under that verdict-driven style, what normally happens is a jury will quickly say, let's take a poll. So immediately, once they're seated, they'll say, do we feel there's a guilty? Now, if 10 or 11 hands go up, what the evidence is showing us now is that there's no deliberation. There's no reason, because the jury is saying we don't need to deliberate. We don't care what the one or two says, because it's not going to be outcome determinative. So now what the research has helped us understand is that these non-unanimous juries are often verdict-driven, which means they're fast, which means they're quick, which means they're unreliable, which means they're often wrong. So we now this is not racial, because this means we've built a system on rapid convictions, which means any defendant, does not matter race, they're not going to get thorough probing. They're not going to get careful discussions. They're going to get a quick process that is often flawed. So now what we had was a deliberate attempt on African Americans, but this is now an unintended consequence of a very bad law. It is affecting everyone in the state of Louisiana at this moment who is subject to our jury system, regardless of race. And I will tell you personally, I don't know how many defendants I've now met who are non-black, who have been victims of Louisiana's non-unanimous jury system, either because they got a rapid conviction that was wrong, or here's another aspect of this that affects all races. People in Louisiana are so afraid of taking the gamble with a jury system that is flawed in this regard that we have a very high rate of people taking plea bargains who might not if we had a unanimous system. So another thing that this system does is it incentivizes people to take plea bargains, all people, not just black people, because of the fear of these non-unanimous jury system, which are now factually known to be unreliable. So there are a lot of unintended consequences that have flowed from this, and if you understand that, it makes sense that Louisiana has always been the forerunner when it comes to mass incarceration until the most recent months where we've moved to the second spot and allowed Kansas now to take the lead. But there are people who will be comforted by that. They'll say we're not number one anymore.
Yeah, but it's not because we got better. It's because they got worse than us.
Absolutely, and I find that quite alarming that we could be comforted in second spot knowing the flaws that are taking place under the guise of a justice system in the state of Louisiana.
I find it appalling, I guess, although that word's overused nowadays, that anybody would tolerate just one unjust sentence for somebody, because that's what this does. You're talking about inaccurate jury decisions and things like that, but it's an injustice to not have a discussion and hear the opposing viewpoints. And I'm looking here at an article from The Advocate from back in on April 1st of this year. It's titled, How an Abnormal Law Deprives, Discriminates, and Drives Incarceration, Tilting the Scales. And they say here that today's defenders of split verdicts And that's what we're talking about here. Allowing a felony conviction without a unanimous jury. But defenders of the current system say that it's important for efficiency by limiting hung juries and potential retrials. It's like the way we are with our environment. Let's do this. It's going to create jobs. It's going to be efficient economically. Who cares what happens to these people? Who cares? It just seems to be the prevalent attitude in America. I wanted to get back to the idea of a jury in the first place. Now, this Apodaca versus Oregon decision in 1972, the U.S. Supreme Court said basically that for federal cases, all felonies had to be unanimous, but that this particular Amendment 6 of the U.S. Constitution did not apply to the states. And that seems totally opposed to how everything else is run. Just about every other part of the Constitution that I know of is applied to the states through the 14th Amendment. But this one, for some reason, was not. Did they give a reason for that?
Apodaca is a very flawed opinion for several reasons, one of which, as I mentioned to you, the lack of research that could have informed the Supreme Court. It just didn't exist. So if you read Apodaca, they never even talk about the real issue, which is what is going to happen when you have a jury of 12 and you're ignoring one or two voices. They never discussed that. What they did do in the opinion is talk about the history of juries, and they talked about the fact that, this word 12, it pops up, in the history of our jury system, but nobody really knows why. Why 12? 12 doesn't really matter. It could be 11, but that was based on conjecture. There was no science. There was no solid reasoning behind that, and I'll tell you the evidence of this is that it's a plurality opinion. And in law, that is a very weak opinion, because what that means is you don't really have a strong majority. So you have 4 and 4, and then somebody breaks the tie, essentially. So you couldn't even see a Supreme Court in complete agreement with Apodaca, which is one of the reasons that I feel very strongly Louisiana's courts should have a long time ago addressed this issue, because Apodaca is flawed. In its reasoning, it does not answer the question at all. It essentially uses conjecture to say it's fine. We can't tell you why it's fine, but it's fine. Now, you mentioned also about this efficiency discussion. I want to also point out this. When you read the transcript from 1880, the one with the very vile racist language, many times you will see those delegates using the word efficiency. Efficiency is like a code word that they were using throughout that convention, 98 days of it. They didn't always say, we're doing this for supremacy reasons. Sometimes they would say, it's about efficiency. So if you read that transcript, you understand that it was a code word. And then when you read the transcript in 73, guess what happens? They dropped the racist language. Why? Because in 1973, we would have been much more sophisticated. We would have known not to use that language. Yep. But what you do see appear on the 1973 transcript is that word efficiency. So when you understand these transcripts and this law, efficiency was a code word to essentially says make it quick so we can get these people back on the plantation, i.e. the prison, because that's what happened when we ended the private slavery. We just changed it to a public slavery system, and we moved the plantations from individual owners to essentially the state now being the owner of the plantation. That was all very well orchestrated, and so the word efficiency shouldn't be taken lightly with this. And you also brought another important point to attention, which is the public safety concern in this. And many times when I talk to potential voters, they'll say to me, well, this doesn't affect me. I mean, I'm a taxpayer. I go to work. I don't commit crimes. I really don't care about the court process. And I caution people to be very careful about thinking along those lines, because if you understand the Sixth Amendment has nothing to do with the criminal at all. The Sixth Amendment is in place for the innocent. It is for people who are accused, which means your taxpayers and your workers and your voters. That's why we have such a thing called the Sixth Amendment.
Exactly.
So nobody should be dismissive of this, believing it doesn't apply to them, because we have all seen, even just this weekend, two young innocent people without criminal histories, one dead, now one about to give his life. That gentleman had no criminal history at all. This was an honorable citizen who would now face the court systems. So this is the intent behind the Sixth Amendment. But the other thing that people have to be mindful of is this. If you have a system that endorses rapid convictions, which we do, it is going to make a lot of mistakes, which we know because of our high exoneration rate in the state of Louisiana. So if we're convicting the wrong people, the right people happen to be amongst us still. So having this law in the books creates a public safety problem, and everybody, taxpayers, workers, everybody should be very concerned about that, because what we all want is a safe community. And what we all want is people who are not fit to be amongst us removed, and people who have the ability to operate amongst us to be able to do so.
Okay.
So this is a public safety matter, and this is a reason why everybody should be out voting to protect our safety in the public.
And this is for Amendment 2 on the November ballot. I will remind the listeners. I wanted to clarify something. Did you say the exoneration rate is also high in Louisiana?
It is. It's very high in Louisiana, and that is largely attributable to our non-unanimous system and to our efficiency system. We rush and we make mistakes, but specifically the Innocence Project gathered all of the men that have been exonerated in Louisiana, and they divided them into two groups. The ones that were capital cases have to be unanimous, so they removed them from this conversation, which left in about half. And of that number, you're looking at almost 40% of those men who are now exonerees convicted under Louisiana's non-unanimous jury system. So we're making a lot of mistakes. It's not 2%. It's not 3%. You're talking close to 50% of men that have been wrongfully convicted. This could have been avoided. In any other state, those convictions would not have even happened.
Okay, so exoneration is something that occurs after they've been convicted. I wanted to clarify that, right? It's a
Right.
challenge. Okay,
And it's usually far removed.
that explains that. Yes, that explains that. There are 2 points I wanted to get in real quickly. One of it, which is Attorney General Jeff Landry's position on this amendment. But I also wanted to mention, too, that it occurred to me, getting ready for this show tonight, that the Amendment 6 of the Constitution requires an impartial jury, not impartial jurors. And if looking at it that way, I think for the whole jury to be impartial, it needs equal numbers of different perspectives, regardless of what that may be. And of course, there was a big hoo-ha made of requiring blacks to be on juries in, felony trials. But if they only put 2 blacks on there and they're going to be ignored, then that's not an impartial jury.
Well, I would absolutely agree with you, and the Tilting the Scale series that you mentioned earlier actually showed us through data collection that we're doing that on a routine basis. And when I say do that, I mean we're denying people of that impartial jury on a routine basis.
Exactly.
What that series showed us is that in some parishes, we should be having X number of blacks called out. It's not that they're not showing up. They're not even being called in the correct numbers. In other parishes, you have inflated numbers of whites that are being called out. So that's a preliminary issue. And then secondarily, it's what happens after they get there.
Right.
So we have some jurisprudence from the U.S. Supreme Court in 1986 that tells us that a prosecutor is not allowed to deny a person jury service because of their race. That's the Batson opinion. Well, Louisiana's law plays a little game with Batson because what it says is, okay, you gave us Batson. I can't stop you from sitting on a jury, but what I will do is I will not allow more than 1 or 2 of you, and so you sit, but I can silence you through the non-unanimous jury
Correct.
system, which is a way of circumventing Batson because it's the same level of discrimination. It just happens on the back and not on the front end.
Right.
So that's another game that prosecutors have played for years. Since 1986, they've had that instruction that they're not allowed to do this, and they just circumvent Batson all day long in Louisiana. And I don't mean to suggest to you that the defense attorneys are not challenging it. I am suggesting to you that we have a system that endorses it.
Yes, I have to agree. We've got just a few more seconds to go, Professor Bell. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I do. I want to also share that the American Bar Association, which regulates the entire practice of law, has been very adamant since 1976 that non-unanimous juries should not be used in felony-level cases. The Louisiana State Bar Association has gone on record since 2016 with a resolution saying the very same thing. And lastly, I want to point out to you that there is a, economic development issue that I think gets overlooked. But if we're concerned about our future in the state and we want businesses to come here, we have to remind ourselves that a business has no reason to consider coming to a place where its workers will not be afforded the full Sixth Amendment rights that they would get in 48 other states. So there's an economic development issue here as well, and we shouldn't overlook that. Finally, I'd like to make sure that everybody's aware that there's some deadlines that are upcoming concerning the vote. October the 9th is the deadline to register to vote. So if you're not registered, October the 9th is the deadline. You can check the Secretary of State's office for further deadlines about voting, but the actual vote is on November the 6th. And this is the most important piece of criminal justice legislation of our lifetimes. So I am pleading and begging, not only should each individual vote, but everybody should be on a mission now to make sure everyone they know speaks their support of Amendment 2. Vote yes to Amendment 2 on November the 6th.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Bell, and I'll do my best to push this again before the election. And I'd like to tell the listeners you've been listening to Wayne Parker and Professor Angela Bell here on A Pause for Thought on Baton Rouge Community Radio, 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge, talking about the proposed Amendment 2, which will be on the ballot in November, which will require unanimous juries for all non-capital offenses. We've got to go. I thank you for listening. Have a good night.